The summoning. The celestial archives floated in the void between galaxies, a structure of crystalline spires and gravity wells that served as the seat of the Galactic Covenant. For 3,000 cycles, it had stood as testament to civilized order, where 700 species resolved disputes through words rather than weapons. Diplomatic envoy Kalen Thrace adjusted his formal jacket as the transport pod docked. He was humanity's first representative to the Covenant, selected not for his combat prowess or scientific genius, but for his ability to read a room and say exactly what needed to be said. At 42, his dark hair showed distinguished silver at the temples, and his gray eyes held the quiet confidence of someone who'd negotiated mining contracts with asteroid barons and peace treaties with Mars separatists. Ambassador Thrace, chirped his liaison, a butterfly-like Meloran named Visith whose wings shimmered with nervous bioluminescence. I must warn you, the quorum is unsettled by your species application. Unsettled how? Kalen asked, following Visith through corridors that seemed to shift and flow like liquid architecture. Your civilization is young. Impulsive. Your planet still bears scars from internal conflicts. Visith's antennae drooped apologetically. Some council members question whether humanity is ready for the responsibility of Covenant membership. They entered the Grand Chamber and Kalen's breath caught. The circular room stretched impossibly wide, with representatives from countless worlds arranged in ascending tiers. Some floated in containment fields filled with exotic atmospheres. Others existed as patterns of light or crystalline formations. The diversity was staggering. At the chamber's center stood High Adjudicator Valon, a towering Carthaxian whose 6 arms moved in elaborate gestures. His species had founded the Covenant, and their word carried immense weight. Human Kalen Thrace, Valon's voice resonated like struck bronze. You petition for full membership in the Galactic Covenant. You understand that with membership comes responsibilities that span millennia? That your species will be bound by every accord, every treaty, every clause written into Covenant law. I do, High Adjudicator. Then let us begin with questions. Valon gestured to the assembly. The floor is open. Immediately, a serpentine Rothani delegate named Ixora slithered forward. Humans have existed as a spacefaring civilization for less than 2 centuries. In that time, you've had 3 civil wars, 12 near-extinction events, and deployed weapons capable of sterilizing your own planet. Why should we believe you're capable of peaceful coexistence? Kalen met her multifaceted eyes without flinching. Because we learned. Every mistake you mentioned taught us something. We didn't achieve unity through conquest or genetic modification or hive mind conditioning. We did it through choice, through argument, through the messy, difficult process of 7 billion individuals deciding that cooperation served us better than conflict. Pretty words, interjected Vorith, a crystalline Gelidian whose voice crackled like breaking ice. But your military expenditure remains among the highest we've observed in developing species. You maintain weapons, armies, strategic reserves. Why if you're so peaceful? Because peace isn't the absence of capacity for violence, Kalen replied. It's the choice not to use it. We maintain strength so we can negotiate from a position of respect, not desperation. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Some delegates' translator implants glowed brighter as they processed this philosophy. Supreme Chancellor Dramathan, an ancient veiled one who existed as a cloud of sentient gas, spoke next. His words arrived directly in Kalen's mind through quantum entanglement. Your species has an unusual legal framework. You encode rights not as privileges granted by authority, but as inherent to existence. This concept troubles some members. It suggests a dangerous individualism. With respect, Chancellor, individualism isn't dangerous, it's dynamic. Our legal traditions developed through adversity. We learned to protect the rights of minorities because we saw what happened when we didn't. We built checks on power because we experienced tyranny. Every clause in our constitutions was written in response to real suffering, real mistakes. And you believe this qualifies you for Covenant membership? Valon asked, leaning forward. I believe it makes us valuable partners, Kalen said carefully. You've built a civilization of order, of precedent, of careful deliberation. That's admirable. But sometimes problems arise that precedent can't address. Sometimes you need someone who thinks differently, who asks uncomfortable questions, who challenges assumptions. Like what? Ixra demanded. Kalen smiled slightly. Like the clause you're all dancing around. The one I noticed while reviewing the Covenant Charter during my journey here. Amendment 73, Section 5, Subsection 9. The one nobody's invoked in 800 cycles. The chamber fell silent. Even the quantum whispers of the veiled ones went quiet. Vaylon's crystalline eyes narrowed. "You've read the entire charter?" "Every word," Kalen confirmed. "Including the parts you hoped I wouldn't notice." "This session," Vaylon announced slowly, "is now sealed under Covenant security protocols. Clear the public galleries." And Kalen knew, the real negotiation had just begun. The forgotten amendment. The public galleries emptied with surprising speed. Kalen watched as journalists, observers and junior diplomats filed out through shimmering portals. Within moments only the core quorum remained, 17 species that held veto power over Covenant decisions. High Adjudicator Vaylon descended from his elevated platform, his 6 arms folded in a gesture Kalen's cultural database flagged as profound unease. "You refer to the arbitration clause," Vaylon said, his voice no longer booming but measured, almost cautious. "Few beings bother to read that deep into Covenant law. Fewer still understand its implications." Kalen pulled up a holographic display from his wrist device, projecting the ancient text into the chamber's center. The words floated in luminous script, automatically translating into each delegate's native language. "Amendment 73, Section 5, Subsection 9, he read aloud. "In circumstances where Covenant law produces outcomes fundamentally incompatible with justice as understood by member civilizations, any species may invoke arbitration protocol. Said protocol suspends standard legal frameworks and empowers a neutral arbiter to examine the conflict between law and justice, with authority to recommend modifications to existing accords." Supreme Chancellor Dromathan's gaseous form rippled with what might have been laughter or dread. "You understand what you're suggesting? This clause was written 3 millennia ago during the Reformation Wars, when the Covenant nearly tore itself apart over legal technicalities that led to the extinction of the Meravine species. It was meant as a safety valve, nothing more. And it hasn't been used in 800 cycles," Kalen continued, "because invoking it requires something none of you have been willing to risk, admitting that your perfect system might be flawed." Ixor's scales rattled, a sign of agitation. "Careful, human. You walk a dangerous line. We didn't invite your species here to lecture us on our own laws." "No," Kalen agreed, lowering the hologram. "You invited us because you need us. The question is, do you know why?" Voritha's crystalline structure pulsed with cold light. "Enlighten us then. Why would the Galactic Covenant need a species barely out of its planetary cradle?" Kalen took a breath, organizing his thoughts. This was the moment that would determine humanity's future among the stars. "Because you're stagnant," he said bluntly. "I've reviewed 800 cycles of Covenant records. Your protocols are brilliant, they've prevented countless wars, resolved millions of disputes. But they've also created a civilization that's terrified of change. You've optimized for stability at the cost of adaptability. Stability has preserved 700 species," Vaylon countered. "And how many have you lost?" Kalen asked quietly. "Not to war but to irrelevance? Species that couldn't adapt to changing circumstances, that were strangled by regulations written for problems that no longer exist? The Meravine you mentioned, they died because the legal process took too long to address their colony's environmental collapse. Your laws were they were simply too slow." The chamber's silence was oppressive. Kalen pressed on. 3 months ago, the Rothani-Jalidian border dispute nearly escalated into armed conflict. I read the mediation reports. Both sides were technically correct under Covenant law, which is precisely why the dispute was unsolvable through standard channels. You only avoided war because both species backed down voluntarily, not because the Covenant provided a solution. Ixor's hood flared. "That matter is classified." "It's relevant," Kalen interrupted. "Just as the Veiled One's current crisis is relevant. Just as the Meloran reproduction restrictions are relevant. You have problems that your current legal framework can't address, and you're too invested in the system to change it. And humans can solve these problems?" Dromathan asked, his mental voice sharp with skepticism. "Not alone," Kalen admitted. "But we can ask the questions you're afraid to ask. We can challenge assumptions without being constrained by 3,000 cycles of precedent. We're young enough to be flexible, old enough to understand consequences." Vaylon's eyes, all 6 of them, fixed on Kalen with unsettling intensity. "You want humanity admitted to the Covenant so you can invoke the arbitration clause." "I want humanity admitted because we can help," Kalen corrected. "The arbitration clause is simply insurance. A tool that exists for exactly these situations. A tool that could unravel everything we've built," Vorith said coldly. "Or strengthen it," Kalen countered. Systems that can't be questioned can't be improved. You built the arbitration clause for a reason. Maybe it's time to remember why. Valon's arms moved in complex patterns, a gesture of deep deliberation. We will adjourn for consultation. Ambassador Thrace, you will remain in quarters aboard the archives. We will summon you when we've reached a decision. As Visith guided him from the chamber, Kalen caught Dromathan's final thought, broadcast perhaps unintentionally: the humans are either our salvation or our undoing. I fear we won't know which until it's too late. Kalen hoped desperately they'd choose to find out. The Midnight Visitor. Kalen's quarters aboard the Celestial Archives were luxurious by any standard, a suite that adjusted its gravity, atmosphere, and lighting to match human preferences. Floor-to-ceiling windows displayed the swirling colors of the galactic void, and the furniture reconfigured itself at his approach. But he couldn't sleep. He stood at the window watching distant nebulae paint the darkness in shades of amber and violet, wondering if he'd overplayed his hand. The cultural briefings had warned him that Covenant species valued consensus, patience, tradition. He challenged all three in a single session. A soft chime announced a visitor. The door's security display showed no image, just a request for entry marked with diplomatic immunity codes. Kalen opened the door to find Supreme Chancellor Dromathan flowing into the room, his gaseous form contained within an elegant framework of energy fields. The ancient Veiled One's presence filled the space with a scent like ozone and old parchment. Chancellor, Kalen said, surprised. I didn't expect. No one expects visits from me. Dromathan's thoughts arrived with a touch of dry humor. I find it advantageous. May we speak candidly, Kalen Thrace? Without recording devices or diplomatic pretense. Kalen gestured to the seating area, which reconfigured to accommodate both human and Veiled One physiology. Of course. You're correct, Dromathan said without preamble. About all of it. The stagnation, the fear, the problems we cannot solve. I've watched the Covenant for 900 cycles, seen it transform from a bold experiment into a mechanism of preservation. We've become what we swore we'd never be, inflexible. Then why the resistance to humanity's membership? Because some truths are dangerous to speak aloud, Dromathan replied. The Quorum knows we need change. But admitting it means acknowledging that our greatest achievement, 3 millennia of relative peace, rests on an increasingly fragile foundation. Leaders don't like admitting their systems are failing. Kalen leaned forward. The Rothani-Jalidian dispute wasn't an isolated incident, was it? No. There are 17 active conflicts that Covenant law cannot resolve. 23 species facing existential challenges our regulations actively prevent them from addressing. And the Veiled Ones. Dromathan's form dimmed. My people are dying, Kalen. Our reproductive cycle requires quantum conditions that are becoming increasingly rare as the universe expands and ages. Covenant environmental protocols prohibit the artificial creation of such conditions. We've petitioned for an exception for 2 centuries. The review process continues. The weight of that confession settled over the room. How long do your people have? 300 cycles, perhaps fewer. We are an ancient species. We've made peace with endings. But to die because bureaucratic procedure moves too slowly? The Chancellor's energy fields flickered with something that might have been rage or despair. That is a death without dignity. Kalen stood, pacing to the window. The arbitration clause could address this. It could address all of it, Dromathan agreed. But there's something you must understand about that clause, something not written in the legal text. It was created by my predecessor, Chancellor Vramith the Wise, during the darkest days of the Reformation Wars. The clause doesn't simply allow for legal review, it empowers the arbiter to rewrite fundamental Covenant law. I know. You read the words. But do you understand the implications? Whoever invokes the arbitration clause doesn't just call for reform. They become responsible for it. The arbiter has ultimate authority, yes, but also ultimate accountability. If their decisions lead to disaster, to war, to the dissolution of the Covenant itself, that burden falls on them alone. Vramith included that stipulation to ensure the clause would only be used in genuine desperation. Kalen turned from the window. Are you telling me not to invoke it? I'm telling you to understand what you're offering. If humanity joins the Covenant and invokes arbitration, your species won't simply be suggesting reforms. You'll be taking responsibility for the oldest, largest political structure in known space. 700 species will be looking to human judgment to solve problems we couldn't solve in 3,000 cycles. That's insane. We've been in space for less than 200 years. Yes, Dromathan agreed. Which is precisely why some of us think you might succeed where we've failed. You haven't learned to fear change yet. You haven't developed the institutional paralysis that comes with millennia of precedent. Kalen sat down slowly. You came here to warn me. I came here to prepare you, Dromathan corrected. Tomorrow the quorum will vote on humanity's membership. The vote will be close, but I believe it will pass. And when it does, you will face a choice. Invoke the arbitration clause and shoulder the burden of reforming the covenant, or play it safe and let things continue as they are. Until the veiled ones go extinct. Until the next crisis covenant law can't solve. Precisely. The Chancellor began drifting toward the door. Choose wisely, Kalen Thrace. The galaxy is watching. After Dromathan left, Kalen stood alone in his quarters, staring at his reflection in the darkened window, wondering if humanity was ready for this responsibility. Wondering if anyone could ever truly be ready. The vote. The Grand Chamber filled differently this time. Gone was the ceremonial grandeur of first contact. Now the atmosphere crackled with tension, with delegates clustered in faction groups, their translators buzzing with hurried negotiations. Kalen entered with Visith, whose wings had lost all color, a Melloran sign of extreme stress. 3 delegations switched positions overnight, the liaison whispered. The Carthaxians are split internally. This has never happened before. Never. High Adjudicator Valon called the session to order with a gesture that somehow conveyed both authority and weariness. His crystalline exoskeleton seemed dimmer than yesterday, as though the weight of impending decision had physically taxed him. We convene to vote on humanity's petition for full covenant membership, Valon announced. Given the unusual circumstances surrounding this application, we will hear final arguments before the vote. Ambassador Thrace, you may speak. Kalen stood, acutely aware that 700 species, represented by the 17 quorum members before him, awaited his words. He'd prepared a speech, diplomatic phrases carefully constructed to appeal to tradition and progress in equal measure. He discarded it. I could tell you about humanity's achievements, he began. Our art, our science, our philosophy. I could promise that we'll be model citizens, that will follow every protocol, honor every tradition. But that would be a lie, and you deserve better. Murmurs rippled through the assembly. Visitha's wings fluttered in panic. The truth is, if you admit humanity to the covenant, we will be disruptive. We will ask uncomfortable questions. We will challenge precedents you've held sacred for millennia. Not because we're arrogant or disrespectful, but because that's who we are. We're a species that questions everything, including ourselves. Ixora's hood flared. You admit you'll violate our customs? I admit we'll engage with them honestly, Kalen replied. When we see something that doesn't make sense, we'll ask why. When we encounter laws that produce unjust outcomes, we'll seek change. And yes, if necessary, we'll invoke the arbitration clause you created for exactly that purpose. The chamber erupted. Delegates shouted in languages Kalen's translator couldn't process fast enough. Valon's arms moved frantically, calling for order. You threaten us? Voritha's voice cut through the chaos like breaking glass. You dare stand before the Galactic Covenant and announce your intention to destabilize our civilization? I'm not threatening, Kalen said calmly. I'm offering. You built the arbitration clause because your founders were wise enough to know that no legal system is perfect. They understood that rigidity leads to brittleness, and brittleness leads to breaking. But you've forgotten that wisdom. You've become so afraid of change that you're letting your own laws strangle you. Bold words, Dromathan observed, his mental voice carrying to all present. Can you back them with action? Kalen met the Chancellor's formless gaze. Give us membership. Right now, today. And I'll invoke the arbitration clause immediately. Put humanity's reputation on the line. Let us prove whether we can help or whether we're just another young species with more confidence than wisdom. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the quantum whispers of data exchange seemed to pause. Valon's voice, when he spoke, was barely audible. You understand what you're proposing? Arbitration immediately, before your species has even established embassies, trade agreements, cultural exchanges? Before you've proven yourselves capable of navigating covenant society? I understand that the Veiled Ones have 300 cycles left, Kalen said. That the Rothani and Jalidians nearly went to war 3 months ago. That 17 conflicts are festering because your legal framework can't address them. How many more crises should we wait through before acting? How many species should go extinct while we establish trade agreements? Ixora slithered forward, her massive form coiling. And if you fail? If your arbitration tears the covenant apart? Then humanity will bear that responsibility, Kalen said simply. Fully and completely. We'll accept the consequences. But if we succeed, if we can help you bridge the gap between law and justice, then 700 species continue thriving. That's a risk worth taking. Valon looked to Dromathan. The Chancellor's energy fields pulsed once, twice, an ancient gesture of affirmation. Very well, Valon said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 millennia. We will vote. But not simply on membership. We will vote on humanity's proposal. Immediate admission with immediate invocation of arbitration protocol. A single vote, binding and final. The adjudicator raised his central arms. All in favor of accepting these terms, signal now. Light bloomed throughout the chamber. Dromathan's quantum signature flared brilliant blue. Ixra's scales shifted to reflective silver. Voritha's crystalline form rang like a struck bell. One by one, 9 of the 17 quorum members signaled approval. The vote carries, Valon announced, sounding simultaneously relieved and terrified. Humanity is admitted to the Galactic Covenant. Ambassador Thrace, do you formally invoke the arbitration clause? Kalen's heart pounded. This was it. No going back. I do. Then by the powers vested in this office, I declare arbitration protocol active. Ambassador Kalen Thrace, you are hereby appointed arbiter with full authority over Covenant legal review. Valon paused. May the ancestors guide us all. We've just changed everything. The weight of worlds. The ceremony lasted 3 hours. Kalen was sworn in using oaths that predated human civilization, granted access codes to archives containing the collective legal knowledge of 700 species, and fitted with a neural interface that would allow him to process Covenant law at superhuman speeds. When it finally ended, he stood alone in the arbiter's chamber, a spherical room that floated in its own pocket dimension, walls displaying every active legal case in the Covenant simultaneously. 17,000 disputes, ranging from territorial disagreements to philosophical conflicts about the nature of consciousness. And now they were his responsibility. Overwhelming, isn't it? Kalen turned to find a being he hadn't seen before, a Lumina named Sereth, whose body was composed entirely of controlled plasma that shifted between humanoid and abstract forms. According to his briefing files, Sereth was the Covenant's chief legal scholar. That's an understatement, Kalen admitted. I'm looking at 3,000 years of accumulated legal complexity, and I have to somehow make sense of it. Sereth's form coalesced into something roughly human-shaped, perhaps as a gesture of solidarity. Previous arbiters, all 3 of them, spent decades just reviewing the cases before making any decisions. You have time. The veiled ones don't have time. Neither do the 17 species facing existential crises. Kalen gestured to the walls. Can you filter these by urgency? Cases where delay means irreparable harm. The display shifted. 17 clusters of light glowed more intensely than the rest. These are the critical ones, Sereth confirmed. But Arbiter Thrace, you must understand, these aren't simple disputes. Each one is critical precisely because it pits fundamental Covenant principles against each other. Resolve one incorrectly, and you could establish precedent that damages thousands of other cases. Kalen studied the clusters. One pulsed with particular intensity, the veiled one reproduction crisis. He reached out and the case files flooded his neural interface. The problem was elegant in its cruelty. Veiled ones required quantum-level environmental conditions to reproduce, conditions that naturally occurred in collapsing star systems. Covenant environmental law prohibited species from artificially inducing stellar collapse, a sensible regulation given that such events could devastate entire sectors. But without access to these conditions, the veiled ones faced extinction. Previous petitions had argued for exceptions, but Covenant law didn't recognize exceptions, only universal principles. Either stellar manipulation was prohibited for everyone, or permitted for everyone. Allowing it risked giving every species the ability to weaponize stars. This is impossible, Kalen muttered. There's no solution that doesn't violate core principles. Now you understand why it's remained unresolved for 2 centuries, Sereth said gently. Sometimes there are no good answers, only choices between which principles we're willing to compromise. Kalen closed his eyes, thinking. On Earth, when faced with impossible choices, legislators didn't just choose between existing options, they created new ones. What if we're asking the wrong question? He said slowly. The problem isn't whether to allow stellar manipulation. It's that we're treating all stellar manipulation as the same thing. A star weaponized to destroy planets isn't the same as a carefully controlled quantum environment created in isolated space. Saratha's plasma body flickered with interest. You propose creating classifications? Degrees of stellar manipulation? More than that. I propose a framework that evaluates intention and impact rather than just action. Veiled One reproduction requires specific quantum conditions, not the wholesale destruction of star systems. We could establish protocols, isolated locations, containment fields, mandatory monitoring. Make it so technically demanding that only species genuinely needing it for survival could pursue it. That would require rewriting Section 12 of the Environmental Accords, Sarath warned. Those accords are foundational. Species have built their entire environmental policies around them. Then we'll help them adapt, Kalen said. The alternative is letting an entire species go extinct because our laws are too rigid to accommodate legitimate needs. He pulled up another critical case, the Rothani-Gelidian border dispute. Both species claimed the Thermix cluster, a resource-rich region of space. Both had valid historical claims under different sections of Covenant territorial law. The contradiction had festered for decades. Same problem, Kalen observed. We're treating this as, who has the better legal claim, when we should be asking, how can both species thrive? What if we established a joint administration? Shared sovereignty with clearly defined resource allocation. Covenant law doesn't recognize shared sovereignty, Sarath noted. Territorial claims must have singular authority. Then we change that law, Kalen said firmly. We create a new category. Joint territories, administered by multi-species councils, with dispute resolution mechanisms built in. Saratha's form pulsed rapidly, excitement or alarm Kalen couldn't tell. You're proposing to remake fundamental covenant law. Not just modify it but introduce entirely new concepts. That's exactly what I'm proposing. Kalen turned to face the legal scholar fully. The arbitration clause doesn't just give me authority to interpret existing law, it empowers me to recommend modifications. Well, I'm recommending we stop treating the covenant legal framework as sacred text and start treating it as what it should be. A living document that evolves to serve its people. Some will call this revolutionary, Sarath warned. Good, Kalen replied. Revolution is long overdue. The resistance, the backlash began within hours. Kalen was in the arbiter's chamber, working with Sarath and a team of legal scholars to draft formal proposals, when Visith burst through the doorway, wings cycling through agitated colors. Ambassador, Arbiter, you need to see this, the Meloran gasped, projecting a holographic news feed. Across the galaxy, protests had erupted. On Karth Prime, thousands of Carthaxians demonstrated outside government buildings, their six-armed bodies forming elaborate protest formations. On Rothana, Ixra herself had delivered a scathing address denouncing human arrogance and legal vandalism. Even moderate species were expressing concern. The most damning clip showed Valon himself speaking to a gathering of Covenant historians. We may have made a grave error in judgment. The humans moved too quickly, proposed changes too radical. They've been arbiter for less than a day and already seek to overturn 3 millennia of carefully balanced law. They're terrified, Kalen observed quietly. Of course they're terrified. Visitha's wings flashed crimson. You're proposing to restructure the legal foundation of galactic civilization. Species have built their entire societies around covenant law as it exists. Changing it means forcing 700 civilizations to adapt simultaneously. Saratha's plasma form dimmed thoughtfully. The Meloran has a point. Perhaps we should slow the process, build consensus before implementing. The Veiled Ones don't have time for consensus, Kalen interrupted. Neither do the other 16 species facing critical crises. Every day we delay is a day closer to extinction for someone. And every day you push forward is a day closer to covenant dissolution, a new voice interjected. A holographic projection materialized. Vorith, the Gelidian representative, his crystalline form radiating cold fury. I'm calling for an emergency quorum session to revoke your arbiter status. You're not reforming the covenant, you're destroying it. By creating shared sovereignty frameworks? Kalen challenged. By allowing species to survive? By introducing chaos into order. Vorith's structure rang like struck ice. You speak of helping the Veiled Ones, but your proposed stellar manipulation protocols would give every species access to star-destroying technology. You speak of solving territorial disputes, but shared sovereignty creates ambiguous authority that could paralyze governance. Your solutions create more problems than they solve. Kalen felt anger rising but forced it down. Vorith wasn't entirely wrong. The proposals did introduce complexity, did create new challenges. but the alternative was stagnation and death. "You're right that my solutions aren't perfect," he admitted. "But they're better than letting species die while we debate for 2 more centuries. I'm open to refinement, to modification, but not to abandonment." "Then you'll face opposition," Vorith said coldly. "Half the quorum already regrets voting for your admission. Push too hard, too fast, and we'll invoke dissolution protocol, remove you from arbiter status and revoke humanity's covenant membership entirely." The projection vanished. Visitha's wings had gone completely gray. "Can they do that?" Saratha's form rippled uncertainly. "Dissolution protocol requires unanimous quorum vote, but, yes, it's technically possible. It's never been used, but the mechanism exists." Kalen sat down heavily, the weight of the situation pressing on him. He'd expected resistance, but not this coordinated, this swift. He'd been arbiter for 23 hours and already faced potential removal. "Maybe Vorith is right," he said quietly. "Maybe I am moving too fast, pushing too hard. Maybe humanity isn't ready for this responsibility. Or maybe the Covenant isn't ready to be saved." All heads turned. Dromathan had materialized without announcement, his gaseous form filling one corner of the chamber. "I've watched civilizations rise and fall for 900 cycles," the Chancellor continued. "I've seen species achieve transcendence and others fade into irrelevance. Do you know what distinguishes those who thrive from those who wither? Not intelligence, not military might, not even wisdom. It's adaptability. The willingness to change when change is necessary, even when change is frightening." "The Covenant is afraid," Kalen said. "Terrified," Dromathan confirmed. "You're forcing them to confront the possibility that everything they've built, while magnificent, is also fragile. That their perfect legal system has cracks. That their 3,000 years of peace rests on increasingly unstable foundations. Fear makes people defensive, reactive, irrational. So what do I do? What you've been doing. But smarter." The Chancellor drifted closer. "You have allies. The 9 quorum members who voted for you didn't do so lightly. The Veiled Ones support you absolutely. The Meloran faction, despite Visitha's panic, recognizes the need for change. Even some Carthaxians, including junior members of Valon's own delegation, believe in your vision. That's not enough to prevent dissolution. No. But it's enough to force negotiation. Vorith wants to paint you as a radical destroyer. Don't let him. Engage with critics, modify your proposals to address legitimate concerns, show that you're willing to collaborate rather than dictate. The arbitration clause gives you authority, but lasting change requires consent." Kalen stood, renewed determination flowing through him. "You're right. I've been so focused on solving problems that I forgot about bringing people along. Time to change approach." He turned to Visith. "Set up meetings with every quorum faction. I want to hear their concerns directly, work with them to refine these proposals. To Sarath, create working groups, mixed species, experts from different legal traditions. Collaborative reform rather than top-down imposition." "Now you're thinking like an arbiter," Dromathan approved. "Change imposed is tyranny. Change chosen together is revolution." The human clause. 6 weeks later, the Grand Chamber reconvened. But this time the atmosphere was different, charged not with fear or anger but with cautious anticipation. Kalen stood before the quorum, flanked by representatives from 23 species who'd worked with him to refine the proposed reforms. Visith was there, wings shimmering with hopeful gold. Sarath pulsed with excited energy. Even Ixra had joined the coalition, her earlier opposition transformed into wary support. High Adjudicator Valon called the session to order. "Arbiter Thrace, you've requested this assembly to present final proposals. The floor is yours." Kalen activated the holographic display, showing not dense legal text but a simple framework diagram. 6 weeks ago, I stood here proposing radical changes to Covenant law. I was right about the need for reform but wrong about the approach. I thought authority meant having the power to impose solutions. I've learned that true authority means building consensus for necessary change. He gestured to his coalition. These representatives don't just support reforms, they helped create them. What I'm about to present isn't human law imposed on alien civilizations. It's collaborative law built by the species it will serve. The diagram expanded, showing 3 core principles. First, adaptive sovereignty. We're introducing shared governance frameworks for disputed territories, joint resource management, and multi-species administration. Not to replace singular authority, but to complement it where appropriate. The Rothani-Jalidian dispute will serve as our pilot program, a jointly administered thermix cluster with clear protocols and built-in mediation. Ixra and Vorith exchanged glances. They'd negotiated this personally, finding common ground after centuries of conflict. Second, graduated environmental protocols. Instead of absolute prohibitions on stellar manipulation, we're creating classification systems based on scale, purpose, and impact. The Veiled Ones will receive authorization for controlled quantum environment generation in designated isolation zones, with technology sharing agreements ensuring it cannot be weaponized. Dromathan's form brightened visibly. Third, and most important, the evolutionary clause. This is what some are calling the human clause, though that's a misnomer. It's a framework that acknowledges Covenant law must evolve alongside the species it serves. Every 50 cycles, the Covenant will conduct comprehensive legal review, examining where law and justice have diverged, where new challenges require new solutions. Veilon leaned forward. You're institutionalizing change. I'm institutionalizing adaptability, Kalen corrected. The arbitration clause was brilliant, but it only activated in crisis. The evolutionary clause makes adaptation proactive rather than reactive. It ensures that 50 cycles from now, when new challenges emerge, the Covenant won't need another desperate gamble like bringing in humanity. It will have built-in mechanisms for addressing evolution. Vorith's crystalline structure rang softly. And who conducts these reviews? Rotating councils drawn from all member species, Sereth interjected, stepping forward. No single species holds permanent authority. Everyone contributes. Everyone adapts together. Murmurs rippled through the assembly, considering, calculating, weighing possibilities. These proposals, Veilon said slowly, represent fundamental restructuring of Covenant governance. Implementing them will take decades, require cooperation from 700 species, demand patience and compromise. Yes, Kalen agreed. But the alternative is letting the Covenant calcify until it shatters. You brought humanity in because you needed fresh perspective. This is that perspective. Law should serve life, not the other way around. A philosophy worth embracing, Dromathan declared, his mental voice resonant with conviction. I formally endorse these proposals on behalf of the Veiled Ones. The Rothani concur, Ixra added, her scales shifting to ceremonial silver. One by one, quorum members signaled approval. Even Vorith, after a long pause, rang his assent. The proposals pass unanimously, Veilon announced, and there was something like wonder in his voice. For the first time in 800 cycles, we have achieved complete quorum consensus on fundamental reform. Ambassador, Arbiter, Kalen Thrace, you have done what many thought impossible. You've taught an ancient civilization how to change. As the chamber erupted in gestures of approval, bioluminescent displays, harmonic resonances, quantum broadcasts, Kalen felt the weight he'd carried for 6 weeks finally lift. They'd done it. Not through force or authority but through collaboration. Visitha's wings blazed with triumphant colors. You've made history. The human clause, the evolutionary clause, will reshape galactic civilization for millennia. It's not the human clause, Kalen reminded gently. It's ours. All of us together. Semantics, Dromathan said with mental warmth. But you're right. This is our achievement. And it begins a new chapter for the Covenant, one where adaptation and tradition work in harmony. Months later, as Kalen prepared humanity's first formal embassy on the archives, he received a message from Earth. His government wanted him to return, to brief them on the negotiations, perhaps to retire with honors. He declined. There was too much work to do. 17 critical cases to resolve. Dozens of species to help adapt to new frameworks. A civilization to guide through its most significant transformation in 3,000 years. Besides, he thought as he watched representatives from across the galaxy gathering for the first Evolutionary Review Council, humanity had finally found its place among the stars. Not as conquerors or saviors but as partners. Ready to question, to challenge, and most importantly, to listen. The Covenant had feared the human clause. Now it embraced it. And the galaxy would never be the same.